The sky still slept in shades of gray when the deck of the aircraft carrier Shokaku began to pulse with mechanical life. It was May 8, 1942, and the coral sea stretched out like a plain of mercury beneath the morning mist. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the salty breeze as dozens of men ran in perfect synchronization, preparing the Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers for what would be one of the most decisive attacks of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura adjusted his flight goggles with hands that did not tremble. 26 years old, graduated from the Etajima Naval Academy, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. His record was impeccable. 14 combat missions, 3 ships sunk, 0 losses in his squadron. The men under his command called him Kun no Taka, the Fortune Hawk. But that morning, as he watched the Type 91 torpedo being loaded beneath the belly of his bomber, something inside him felt different. The order was clear. The American task force had been located 280 kilometers to the south. 2 enemy aircraft carriers, the USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown, sailed vulnerable, their escorts scattered. Imperial High Command had decreed, sink them at all costs. It was the chance to break the backbone of the American Navy in the Pacific, to ensure that Japan's advance continued unstoppable toward Australia and beyond. Nakamura knew the numbers, knew the statistics. He knew that every American aircraft carrier destroyed meant hundreds fewer planes in the sky, thousands fewer sailors to man the ships, months of strategic advantage. He also knew what failing to destroy those ships would mean for Japan. The war would drag on. The empire would bleed resources it didn't have. Men would die on islands whose names they didn't even know. Nakamura-san. Commander Takahashi's voice cut through his thoughts. The older man approached with firm steps, his face marked by burn scars from an earlier battle. Your squadron will lead the second wave. 6 torpedo bombers. Primary target, the Lexington. She's the bigger one. Hi, Commander. Nakamura bowed slightly. You seem troubled, Lieutenant. No, sir. Just checking the flight plans. Takahashi studied him for a moment too long. The Emperor is counting on us, Nakamura. Your family is counting on us. Every man on this deck carries the honor of 100 generations. The words were familiar. Nakamura had heard them 1,000 times during training, in the speeches before missions, in the letters his father sent him. Bushido, the way of the warrior. Loyalty above all. Victory or death. But there was something Takahashi didn't know. Something nobody on the Shokaku knew. 3 weeks earlier, Nakamura had received a letter. Not from his father, the respected history professor in Kyoto. Not from his mother, who prayed daily at the temple for her son's safety. The letter had come from someone he hadn't seen in 4 years. Thomas Brennan, his exchange colleague when Nakamura had studied naval engineering in San Diego in 1937. The letter had arrived through a neutral channel, via Switzerland. It was short, almost telegraphic. Hiroshi, I heard you're serving. Me too. Fighter pilot, USS Yorktown. I imagine our paths might cross somewhere in this damned ocean. If they do, I hope you miss. Not out of cowardice, but because I still believe you're the man I knew, someone who understands there are things more important than flags. My little sister, Sarah, she asks about you in her prayers. Take care of yourself, my friend. Tom. Nakamura had burned the letter immediately. Possessing it was treason. But the words remained, burning hotter than the paper. Now, as the first rays of sun began to gild the horizon, he looked at the faces of the men around him. Yamada, only 19, who dreamed of being a teacher. Sato, who kept in his pocket a crumpled photo of his newborn daughter he'd never met. Ito, the veteran navigator who recited haikus before every mission. Pilots, to your aircraft! The shout echoed across the deck. The roar of the Nakajima Sakae engines filled the air. One by one, the bombers began accelerating down the carrier's runway, launching themselves into the void before gaining altitude. Nakamura was the third to take off. The weight of the torpedo made the plane feel sluggish, reluctant to abandon gravity. Gradually, the squadron formed up. 6 torpedo bombers in tight formation. Above them, 8 Zeros provided escort. Below, the Pacific Ocean stretched infinite, indifferent to the human drama unfolding in its skies. The mission leader's voice crackled over the radio. Formation holding. Heading 185. Cruising speed. ETA, 42 minutes. 42 minutes to target. 42 minutes until Nakamura discovered what kind of man he really was. The sun rose slowly, tinting the clouds pink and gold. It was the kind of dawn that, in another time, would have inspired poetry. Now it inspired only silence. Nakamura looked at the photograph clipped to his instrument panel. His mother, his father, his younger sister. All smiling in front of the Kaya-Mizudera Temple in Kyoto. That photo had been taken in a world that no longer existed. And then, on the distant horizon, they began to appear. Small dark dots against the gray of the sea. The American Task Force. The radio remained silent for a few more moments. Then, the leader's calm voice, targets confirmed. 2 aircraft carriers. Multiple escorts. Prepare for coordinated attack. Nakamura felt his breathing accelerate. His hands tightened on the controls. The torpedo beneath his plane weighed 848 kilograms. Enough explosive to tear open the hull of any ship. Enough to kill hundreds of men in seconds. Men like Thomas Brennan. The Japanese formation began to descend. From 3,500 meters to 1,200, then to 500. The air grew denser, the Nakajima B-5N's engine vibrating with a deep roar that Nakamura felt in his bones. Through the telescopic sight, the ocean transformed from an abstract surface into a real battlefield. White wakes of ships cutting through the water, destroyers arranged in defensive pattern, and there, imposing and vulnerable, the 2 American aircraft carriers. The Lexington was impossible not to recognize. Enormous, nearly 270 meters long, her deck filled with aircraft preparing to launch. The Yorktown, slightly smaller, sailed 3 kilometers away, her escort tighter. Between them, like nervous guard dogs, cruisers and destroyers traced erratic patterns, their anti-aircraft gun turrets already beginning to elevate. Attention, first wave. The voice on the radio was metallic but firm. Dive bombers commence in 30 seconds. Torpedo bombers await signal for coordinated attack. Nakamura watched as the Aichi D-3A, the dive bombers nicknamed Val by the Americans, began their deadly descent. Like hawks falling on prey, they plunged almost vertically, their wind sirens creating that characteristic howl that froze the blood of even the most experienced sailors. The sky exploded in anti-aircraft tracers. Red and orange lines tore through the air in all directions. The ship's 40mm cannons began spitting fire, creating curtains of fragmented steel that transformed the space into a mechanical meat grinder. Nakamura saw the first Val get hit, a sudden explosion, the aircraft disintegrating into a fireball that fell spinning toward the sea. Second group, begin approach. The order came firm, without hesitation. Nakamura's squadron began descending to torpedo attack altitude, just 50 meters above the water. At this height, each wave seemed like a mountain, each gust of wind a mortal threat. Flying so low with a nearly 1-ton torpedo required absolute concentration. A second of distraction and the plane would plunge straight into the ocean. But it was the only way. Torpedoes needed to be launched low and straight, allowing them to enter the water at the correct angle and run toward the target at 40 knots. Too high and they would break on impact. Too low and the plane would crash before launch. Fan formation. Targets designated. Squadron leader Commander Murata coordinated with surgical precision. Nakamura, Yu and Yamada on the Lexington, port sector. Sato and Ito on starboard sector. Ogawa and Tanaka, Yorktown, southern approach. Understood. The responses came in rapid sequence. The Lexington was now just 5 kilometers away. Nakamura could see details. Men running across the deck, guns swiveling to track them, an F-4F Wildcat fighter desperately trying to gain altitude to intercept. The carrier began to turn, trying to present the smallest profile possible, but a ship that size doesn't change direction like a fighter. It was time. Nakamura dropped even lower, feeling the spray of water hitting the windshield. Speed was perfect, 220 kilometers per hour. Altitude, 45 meters. Distance, 3,500 meters and decreasing. The optimal launch point would be at 800 meters, close enough to guarantee a hit, far enough to have a chance of escape. And then he saw them. On the deck of the Lexington, men were running. But they weren't just anonymous silhouettes. At this distance, with the morning light now clear, Nakamura could see faces. Young. Frightened. A sailor stumbled and fell, another helped him up. An anti-aircraft gunner, no more than 20 years old, clung to his gun's controls with hands that visibly trembled. Men. Just men. No different from Yamada, at his side. No different from Sato, with his newborn daughter. No different from himself. Nakamura, confirm position. Murata's voice cut through his thoughts. Position confirmed. Beginning final run. His own voice sounded distant, automatic. 2,000 meters. The anti-aircraft tracers intensified. A line of projectiles passed so close that Nakamura felt the plane shake with the turbulence. To his left, he saw Yamada make a sharp correction, avoiding by centimeters a barrier of fire. 1,500 meters. Thomas Brennan's face appeared in his mind. The easy laugh. The nights in San Diego, discussing aviation and engineering and dreams of peace. There are things more important than flags, Hiroshi. 1,200 meters. His fingers found the torpedo release lever. A simple movement. Pull back. The torpedo would drop, enter the water, run straight and true. 300 kilograms of Type 97 explosive would penetrate the Lexington's hull below the waterline. The explosion would open a hole the size of a house. Water would flood in at thousands of liters per second. Men would drown in sealed compartments. Others would burn when the aviation fuel ignited. 1,000 meters. Ideal distance. Nakamura saw everything with impossible clarity. The number 2 painted on the Lexington's command tower. A lifeboat swaying against the hull. A tattered American flag fluttering in the breeze. And then he saw something else. On the carrier's deck, a man stood still, motionless while everyone else ran. Pilot's uniform. Looking directly upward. Looking directly at him. It couldn't be. The distance was too great. But for an impossible instant, Nakamura swore he recognized that posture. That way of standing, one hand shielding his eyes from the sun. Tom. Now. All torpedo bombers, release. The order came with absolute urgency. To the right, Nakamura saw Sato release his torpedo, the weapon dropping, entering the water with a perfect splash, its trail of bubbles running straight toward the target. His fingers gripped the lever, but didn't pull. 800 meters. Something inside him froze. It wasn't fear. It wasn't cowardice. It was something deeper, more fundamental. It was his mother's voice reading to him as a child, a samurai warrior fights not just from obedience, but for justice. It was the image of Sarah Brennan, Tom's little sister, 9 years old when he'd met her, asking if the stars in Japan were different. It was the memory of the professor in San Diego who had taught him calculus and told him, "Knowledge has no nationality, Hiroshi. Truth belongs to everyone." 700 meters. The radio exploded in shouts. Nakamura. Release the torpedo. Now. But he didn't release it. His hands pulled back on the stick. The Nakajima B-5N responded heavily, the torpedo still attached to the plane's belly, making it slow, vulnerable. He turned left, banking away from the Lexington, away from the perfect attack line. "Nakamura, what are you doing?" Beside him, Yamada looked across the distance between the aircraft, his eyes wide with shock and incomprehension. A 40mm shell exploded less than 10 meters ahead. Shrapnel punched holes in the engine cowling. Black smoke began to stream. But Nakamura kept turning, flying now parallel to the Lexington, not toward it. The torpedo remained attached, useless. He had refused. And in that moment, everything changed. The sky transformed into pure chaos. "Traitor! Traitor!" Murata's voice on the radio was no longer calm. It was a scream of fury and disbelief. "Nakamura, you've condemned us all." And he was right. The attack plan depended on perfect coordination. 6 torpedoes converging simultaneously, forcing the Lexington to choose which threat to evade, guaranteeing that at least 3 or 4 would hit. But with Nakamura refusing to launch, the formation was broken. The Americans could concentrate all anti-aircraft fire on the remaining 5 torpedo bombers. And that's exactly what they did. A wall of flaming steel rose between the Japanese attackers and their targets. The Lexington's quad 40mm guns and those of her escorts vomited projectiles at a rate of 600 per minute. The sky turned black with explosions. Red tracers crisscrossed in deadly geometric patterns, creating a labyrinth of fire through which no aircraft could pass unscathed. Nakamura saw Sato get hit first. A 127mm shell struck directly into the Nakajima's engine. The plane exploded instantly. There was no time to eject, to scream, to think. Just fire. The fireball fell spinning, scattering debris in a wide arc before plunging into the ocean. The photo of Sato's daughter disintegrated with him. "No!" Yamada's scream tore through the radio. The young pilot, only 19 years old, watched his mentor die. Saw the man who had taught him to fly transform into smoke and twisted metal. And then Yamada did something the tactical manuals never predicted. Something driven not by strategy, but by pure pain. He accelerated. Straight toward the Lexington. Without releasing the torpedo. Without caring about ideal distance or attack angle. Just accelerated, transforming his torpedo bomber into a missile guided by desperation and rage. "Yamada! No!" Nakamura screamed, but it was too late. Yamada's Nakajima flew straight through the curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Nakamura saw the impacts tearing through the wings, the cockpit, the fuselage. Saw blood spraying across the windshield. Saw the young body of Yamada jerk with each impact, but still continue flying, continue accelerating. The American gunners on the Lexington realized the intention too late. Some abandoned their posts and ran. Others kept firing until the last second. Yamada collided with the carrier's deck at 300 kilometers per hour. The explosion was catastrophic. The torpedo still attached to the aircraft detonated on impact. 300 kilograms of explosive, plus aviation fuel, plus the ammunition aboard. The fireball engulfed a third of the flight deck. Aircraft prepared for launch were thrown like toys. Men were vaporized instantly. Others ran in flames, jumping into the sea to escape the pain. The Lexington shuddered with the impact. Black smoke poured into the sky. But the carrier kept sailing. Wounded, bleeding, but still alive. "Nakamura!" Murata's voice was breaking, somewhere between rage and agony. "See what you caused?" "See." Nakamura saw. Saw perfectly. Of the 6 torpedo bombers, 3 were destroyed. Sato, Yamada, and now Ito, whose plane had been hit in the fuel tank and was falling in a spiral, leaving a trail of black smoke. The old navigator who recited haikus would have no time for more poems. Only 3 torpedo bombers remained. And of the 3 torpedoes launched, 2 missed. The Lexington managed to maneuver enough to avoid them. Only one hit, tearing a hole in the hull, but not fatal. Not enough to sink that steel giant. The mission had failed. And Nakamura knew that the blood of those men was on his hands as much as if he himself had pulled the trigger. Retreat. All aircraft, retreat. The order came from the mission leader, but the voice was empty. Defeated. Nakamura's plane was dying. The smoke from the damaged engine grew thicker. The instrument panel showed oil temperature in the red zone. He still carried the torpedo. The extra weight drained fuel twice as fast. He needed to jettison. But where? Below, the ocean was full of debris. Bodies floated among oil slicks. A lifeboat from the Lexington was trying to rescue survivors from the explosion. Nakamura could see faces, Americans and Japanese mixed together, all just men trying to survive. A movement caught his attention. An American fighter, F-4F Wildcat, was climbing in pursuit. The pilot had seen the damaged Nakajima, slow, vulnerable. Easy prey. Nakamura turned sharply, but the torpedo made him heavy, slow. The Wildcat's .50 caliber machine guns opened fire. Tracers passed too close, perforating the left wing. More smoke. More alarms. He was dead. He knew it. The question was just when. And then he saw the American pilot's face. For a brief instant, when the Wildcat passed close on its first pass, Nakamura saw through the cockpit. Saw the leather helmet, the flight goggles, the tense face of concentration. And recognized Thomas Brennan. Impossible. The Pacific Ocean was too vast, the odds too small. But somehow, amid the chaos of thousands of men trying to kill each other, the two friends had found each other. Tom lined up for the second attack. His machine guns were loaded. Nakamura was out of options, without fuel for maneuvers, without speed to escape. The Wildcat's radio must have been open, because Nakamura heard, distant, broken, but unmistakable. Jesus Christ. Hiroshi. The Wildcat decelerated. Not much, but enough. Tom flew alongside the damaged Nakajima, looking across the 50-meter distance between cockpits. Their eyes met. Nakamura saw everything in Tom's face. Shock. Recognition. Pain. And then, a silent question. Why? Nakamura pointed to the torpedo still attached to the aircraft. Then made a gesture, cutting his throat, shaking his head. Didn't launch. Couldn't. Tom understood. The Wildcat could end it all right there. One shot. Just one well-placed shot and the Nakajima would disintegrate. Orders were orders. War was war. But Tom turned sharply to the right, banking away. His voice crackled over the radio, transmitting to his command, target escaped into clouds. Lost contact. Returning to base. It was a lie. The sky was clear. Anyone could see. But nobody questioned. Nakamura watched the Wildcat pull away, then turn back toward the Lexington. The carrier still burned, but her damage control teams were already working. She would survive. For now. The Nakajima's engine finally choked and died. Silence, except for the wind and the distant roar of battle. He had, perhaps, 3 minutes before falling into the sea. Nakamura looked one last time at the torpedo. That weapon he didn't fire. Then pulled the emergency release lever. The torpedo dropped free, plunging into the Pacific and sinking into the depths, never fulfilling its purpose. He glided the dead plane toward a clear area of ocean, away from the combatants. The impact was brutal, the water like concrete. The Nakajima broke in half. Freezing water flooded the cockpit. But Nakamura managed to break free. Managed to swim. Managed to inflate the life vest. As he floated, he watched the Shokaku on the distant horizon. His carrier. His home. His duty. A duty he had betrayed, or fulfilled in the only way his conscience would allow. The Pacific Ocean doesn't care about ideals, doesn't care about honor, duty, or moral dilemmas. It's just water, indifferent, patient, deadly. Hiroshi Nakamura floated for 4 hours before being rescued. Not by Japanese forces. The Shokaku had withdrawn from the combat zone, believing all lost pilots were dead. There was no time or resources for search and rescue operations, not when American fighters still patrolled the skies. Who found him was an American destroyer, the USS Hammond. Nakamura remembers the moment when he saw the gray bow cutting through the waves toward him. Remembers thinking it would be easier to just release the life vest, let himself sink. A clean death. An escape from what would come after. But something, perhaps instinct, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps simple curiosity about what would happen, made him keep holding on. When American hands pulled him onto the deck, he didn't resist. Just let himself be taken, his soaked uniform dripping salt water, his empty eyes looking at faces that should be enemies but seemed just tired. "Jesus, he's just a kid," a sailor murmured. Nakamura was 26 years old. He felt like he was 100. They took him below, to a compartment improvised as a cell. There were no chains, just a metal bunk and a guard at the door. The medical officer checked if he was injured. He wasn't, not physically. Offered water, he drank, and then left him alone. Alone with his thoughts. Alone with the images of Yamada exploding against the Lexington's deck. Alone with the image of Sato disintegrating in flames. Alone with the weight of every torpedo the other pilots launched, torpedoes that hit because he didn't launch his, because he broke formation, because he hesitated. Traitor, Murata had screamed. The word echoed. 3 days later, Nakamura was transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Brisbane, Australia. The interrogation was strange. American intelligence officers were confused. A Japanese pilot, flying a torpedo bomber, overflew an American aircraft carrier at ideal attack distance and didn't fire, and now was cooperating fully, answering questions about tactical formations, aircraft capabilities, carrier positioning. "Why didn't you attack?" The officer, Captain Reynolds, graying hair, burn scar on his neck, asked for the 10th time. Nakamura was silent for a long moment, then answered in the only way he could articulate. "Because I saw faces." Reynolds frowned. Faces. On the deck. Men running. Frightened. Young. Like the men who flew with me. Like... He paused, swallowed hard. "Like a friend who studied with me in San Diego." Reynolds studied him with an expression Nakamura couldn't decipher. Then, unexpectedly, the American officer laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of mockery. It was bitter, tired. "You know what that makes you, son? Human. Just terribly, damnably human." Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "War would be so much easier if we were all monsters." News of Nakamura's refusal to attack reached Japanese high command through reports from surviving pilots. The reaction was swift and brutal. His family in Kyoto was visited by the Kempitai, the military police. His father, the respected professor, was forced to resign. His sister was expelled from school. His mother, broken by shame, stopped going to the temple, not because she stopped praying, but because she couldn't bear the judgmental stares. A letter reached Nakamura at the POW camp, via the Red Cross. It was from his father. Short. Formal. "Hiroshi, you have brought dishonor impossible to wash away. Your name has been erased from our family. Do not write again. You are dead to us." Nakamura read the letter 3 times. Then folded it carefully, placed it in his shirt pocket, and didn't cry. There were no tears left. But there was another side to the story. On the USS Lexington, while damage control teams fought fires and flooding, pilot Thomas Brennan stood on the ruined deck, looking at the sky where his friend had disappeared. "You knew him?" His commander, Commander Wade McCluskey, approached, his face black with soot. "In another life," Tom answered quietly, "when we were just students who liked airplanes." McCluskey was silent for a moment. "He could have sunk us." "I know. But he didn't." "I know." McCluskey placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "You let him escape." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Tom met his superior's eyes. Expected to see anger, accusation, but saw only exhaustion, and perhaps, deep down, something that might be understanding. "Yes, sir. I did." McCluskey nodded slowly. "This stays between us. You understand what would have happened if—" "I understand, sir." More silence. Then McCluskey looked at the destruction around them, bodies being covered with tarps, wounded being carried to the infirmary, the smoking hole where Yamada had sacrificed himself. "War shouldn't require friends to kill each other," McCluskey said, so low Tom almost didn't hear. "But it does. Every damned day it does." He walked away, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended technically in a draw. The Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered significant damage to the Shokaku. The Americans lost the USS Lexington, which would sink hours later due to internal fuel explosions, and the Yorktown was damaged. But strategically, it was an American victory. For the first time, Japanese advance was stopped. The invasion of Port Moresby was cancelled. The empire of the rising sun had bled and retreated. And part of that, a small part, but real, was because a Japanese pilot hesitated. Historians would never know. Official Japanese records listed Nakamura as killed in action, dishonorable conduct. American records listed him as prisoner of war, cooperative. But the truth was more complicated. Nakamura spent the next 3 years in prisoner camps. First in Australia, then transferred to the United States when space became limited. He taught English to other prisoners. Learned carpentry. Read every book he could find.